Hello, welcome back to Overcast. This is part 2 of a Dark Souls video where I talk about all the problems that the Dark Souls game series has. And there's also episode 3 of a podcast I'm making. If you haven't seen the first part, then you don't have to watch the first episode of the podcast because it's not related to this, but you should watch if you're interested, you should watch the first Dark Souls, the first part of the Dark Souls video, because I'm going to be continuing off of that. This is part 2 of that. So without further ado, let's start. So, the first thing I have written down on this section, which the section is named Combat Mechanics, several enemies and bosses can one-shot you. This is consistent through all the Souls games. I'm pretty sure there isn't a single one of them that doesn't have a point where you can get one shot. And getting one shot is... I shouldn't have to explain why it's a bad thing, but I'll do it anyway, just in case there's some people that are wanting to defend it. The idea of... the thing about one shots is that they force you to play the game perfectly. If you make even one mistake, or even if it's not even a mistake, but it's just you don't... maybe you're encountering a new enemy and you don't know what its movement attack patterns are, so you don't know how to dodge it properly, and you don't get a chance to figure it out yourself because it can potentially just one-shot you. There are also times when instead of just getting one shot, you get like 2 or 3 shot, but the first attack stuns you, or maybe it's a grab attack and it freezes you in place, or something like that, making the next attack or the next couple attacks inevitably hit you, which is effectively the same thing as a one-shot because you die after the first hit lands, you're toast either way, and there's no way to change that, no matter how good you are playing the game. That's not good. That's really bad. You shouldn't be forced to play a game perfectly in order to not die. Like, even if you put a bunch of points into health, for example, and like you're not hollow, you're embered up or whatever, whichever game you're playing, you have like a ton of health, like to the point where sometimes your health bar is like takes up half the screen, and you can still get one shot sometimes, which is just ridiculous. You shouldn't have to, again, you shouldn't have to play perfectly in order to not die. That's just ridiculous. It's asking too much of the player. The next thing is you can get it. This is actually similar to the last thing I talked about, but you can get stun locked. When you get hit in Dark Souls, you usually get stunned for a short amount of time. There's it generally depends on the weapon and the enemy that you're fighting that you got hit by. Some enemies will only stun you for a second. Some attacks will stun you for a lot longer than that. And depending on the game, sometimes you can roll out of stuns. Like in Dark Souls 3, if you get knocked to the ground, you can roll while you're knocked to the ground and you'll get up slightly faster, which is good. But there's still enough stun in the game that you can in fact get stun locked. Some enemies attack incredibly quickly, and so the first hit lands, you're stunned and can't move for, I don't know, however long the stun lasts. And while you're stunned, you get hit 1 or 2 more times, or even more perhaps, and you just die. For example, in Dark Souls 1, in the DLC, the boss Manus has this one attack where you have to like that fight was decent, but there's this one attack where if you're not positioned perfectly and you don't have enough health to outlast it, you're basically toast. It does so much damage, and like basically what he does is he grabs you, flings you into the air, slams you down on the ground, and hits you multiple times, all in one attack. And if the first part of the attack hits you, the rest is guaranteed to hit you. So it's effectively, even if technically you don't die in one shot, it's effectively the same as just a one shot kill. And that's just, it's just bad. And Manus isn't even the only boss that does that. There's other bosses that do this, there's enemies that do this. If you get stuck in a corner when there's like three enemies there, there's literally nothing you can do about that. Like, once you get in that situation, you're toast, because no matter how good you are at the game, you can't roll through them most of the time. Like 90% of the time, you can't roll through them because you can't roll through enemies generally, and you can't attack them because your attack animation takes too long, and your attack animation keeps getting interrupted. So you pull your sword back to swing it, and then you get hit, and it resets the animation, preventing you from attacking. So you can't roll, you can't attack, and you can't just move out of the way because they're in the way, blocking you. And so if you get in that situation, you're basically toast. And there's several points in the game where the game will throw multiple enemies at you, and it doesn't really, it makes it really easy to get in this situation. You might be saying, well, the goal is to not get in that situation in the first place, and that's how you avoid it. But again, you should be able to make more than one mistake before dying instantly. And again, a lot of times it's not even you making a mistake with your gameplay. Sometimes it's just bad luck, or you being put in a new situation that you don't know how to properly deal with. So, Ingenious Clown made a video about why stuns are his most hated game mechanic, and I'm going to link that in the description of this video. So, I might even put a card on screen right now to link to it. So go watch that, and it explains this in more detail. Alright, the next thing I have is you can start the game with more equipment than you can carry. This problem is exclusive to Dark Souls 1 and 2, I believe. Maybe not Dark Souls 2, but 100% Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. If you choose the Knight class, where you start off with heavy armor, you start off with a fat roll. Technically, the game doesn't consider it a fat roll, it's a normal roll, but in Dark Souls 1, the normal roll is the equivalent of fat rolling in Dark Souls 3, so I'm going to call it a fat roll. And the fat roll is an even fatter roll, which is even worse. So you basically, in Dark Souls 1, you basically have to keep your character under 30% equip weight all the time if you actually want to have a mildly functional roll mechanic. This is terrible, especially since the vast majority of the game is designed around rolling as a mechanic. You're supposed to, the entire point of that's like the main gameplay loop is rolling to knowing when to roll to dodge enemy attacks so you don't get hit. But if you have a roll that is sucky and doesn't work, you can't do that. And like, yeah, I get that the idea is supposed to be that, oh, it gives you more protection, and so you're exchanging movement speed for defense, but it barely gives you any defense, and it certainly doesn't give enough to be worth it, the trade-off. So, I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. Fortunately, they didn't do it in Dark Souls 3, and so they seem to have kicked that habit, which is good. It does seem like the later Dark Souls games, specifically Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, even though it's technically not a Souls game, it seems like the later games are better than the earlier ones. So it does seem like From Software is actually learning slowly how to actually make a good game, which is definitely a good thing. But it's still a problem in more games than it should be. And it's something they could have fixed in Dark Souls Remastered, but that barely did anything. I mean, well, okay, it made the game more playable, I think. I don't know exactly what it changed because I didn't play the original version. But yeah, so next we have the game never tells you about important mechanics like equip load and fat rolling. I played a ton of Dark Souls 3 fat rolling because I didn't know it was a mechanic. There is an option where you can go to the menu and you like press in the left stick or something, and it'll give you information about what part of the screen your cursor is hovering over, so you can get a little more information about the game. But it's still, first off, that mechanic is hidden because there's so much stuff on the screen, and if you show someone who's never played Dark Souls one of the Dark Souls inventory screens, they're gonna have no idea what's going on because it's so there's stuff everywhere. It's so complicated. There's all sorts of stats and numbers that you don't understand. You don't know what they're there for, what they do, and you might not even notice the prompt to inspect the screen more closely. I didn't notice it for the longest time, and so I was fat rolling for a long time because I didn't even know that was a mechanic. Uh, and so I was like, why do I keep getting hit while I'm rolling? Turns out it was because I was fat rolling. And even if I wasn't fat rolling, I probably would have gotten hit multiple times while rolling anyway, because even if you're light rolling, you can still get hit while rolling, which is kind of ridiculous because the entire point of rolling is to avoid getting hit. Yes, it does give you iframes, but the iframes do not last as long as the animation, which means it's unintuitive, and you don't know, like, you don't know when the iframes show up. Do the iframes show up when you start, just for the first part of the roll, the middle of the roll, the end of the roll, all the way through? You don't know that when you first start the game. And the only thing that changes that is experience, which means you're going to have to get hit while rolling tons of times before you actually figure out when the iframes are. And you shouldn't have to. People praise Dark Souls for not holding your hand and not and respecting the player's intelligence, which translates to literally not telling the player about important game mechanics that they need to know about, like fat rolling and equip load. And for some reason, people think that's a good thing that it doesn't do that because it respects the player's intelligence and all that stuff. But seriously, if the game doesn't tell you something, then there's not an easy way for you to figure it out yourself. And I'm constantly wondering how people even manage to figure out a lot of the mechanics of the game without like data mining it or something. That's actually okay. Never mind. I was gonna talk about NPC quest lines, but I actually have that written down further down in my list. So let's go to the next thing, which is grab attacks. This is quite possibly the worst game mechanic that Dark Souls has. And I've been encountering it quite a lot in the Dark Souls 3 DLC, Ashes of Ariandel. There's this one spot where you're in this giant barn dungeon. It's like a cross between a barn and a dungeon, and it's got a bunch of giant bugs in it. And they have a grab attack that they spam. There's like 50 of them in there, and so you're constantly having them get that grab attack. And the problem with grab attacks is that, number one, you can't block them. Number two, it's much harder to dodge a grab attack than it is to dodge a normal attack, because they sort of seem to they seem to have bigger hitboxes. Like, they sort of suck you in. So even if you're outside of what visually, like, let's say a giant enemy tries to grab you with their hand. Even if you're next to their hand, sometimes you'll just snap to their hand and you'll get grabbed anyway, even though it looked to you like you were in a safe place. And that's a problem when the game doesn't properly communicate reliable information to the player. Then you can do something that to your eyes seems perfectly safe, perfectly fine, and it looks like it should work. It feels like it should work, but it doesn't. Just like the Dark Souls 1 terrible backstab hitboxes, where the hitbox, the direction that is actually behind the enemy is different than the direction that looks like it's behind the enemy. So you either have to get used to where they are, or you just have to guess, or you just have to do your best and then fail like 90% of the backstabs you attempt, because the Dark Souls backstab hitboxes don't line up with the actual animations. So you're not actually backstab. Like, you can attack an enemy from the front and somehow get a backstab, and then attack an enemy from directly behind it and not get a backstab. It's the same concept here. It doesn't communicate properly where you need to be in order to avoid the attack. And once you get hit by a grab attack, you're locked in. So it's a lot of times it's a one-hit kill for you, because it'll deal a ton of damage. Grab attacks usually deal a ton of damage. Sometimes the grab attack ends with you being thrown, which can often launch you off a cliff, and which also instantly kills you. And there's so many things where it basically, if you get hit by one grab attack, you're dead. It's effectively a one-hit kill in a lot of situations. And again, one-hit kills are not good because you shouldn't be expected to play the game perfectly in order to avoid dying. There are some games that kind of work like that, like Ghost Runner, I think, is one where the entire point is that both you and the enemies die in one hit. But it has like really common checkpoints, so you don't lose much progress if you die, and you can't lose progress permanently. Like in Dark Souls, where you can lose souls permanently if you die more than once without managing to pick up your souls, which is very likely because if you died there, then that means it's a dangerous place, which means it's probably going to be difficult to get your souls and get out of there without dying again. And if you die twice in a row, then you lose your souls permanently, which means you can lose potentially quite a lot of progress. And grab attacks are just, first off, it's like cutscene stupidity when a player's in a cutscene and logically they should do something like fight the enemy, but they're in a cutscene, so they just stand there, not being under the player's control, and wait for the cutscene to finish instead of actually going and doing something, which would make sense. It's basically the same concept here with grab attacks. Is like an enemy grabs onto you, instead of like pushing them away or something. Like grab attacks would be fine if there was a thing where like you could dodge out of them. Like if you spam the dodge button, you'd push the enemy away and dodge out of it. But that's not a thing. It might be. I know that in Bloodborne there's a mechanic where I think if you spam the left and right bumper buttons when you're in the middle of a grab attack, you'll get out of it sooner and take less damage. But I don't know if that's a game mechanic in Dark Souls, but if it is, it's never communicated to the player, so the player doesn't even know that feature exists. And you can't hide the rules of a game from someone and then expect them to play well. That's just not how that works. So grab attacks are just incredibly bad. They take way too much damage from you, often one-shotting you or making it so you get killed instantly when the grab attack is finished. And they're just bad. I should not have to sit here and watch a long, like 5-second animation of my character getting killed only to die at the end and just have to sit there and wait. Sitting there and waiting and watching helplessly as your character dies is something that is not in the slightest fun. And the entire point of games is to be fun, but that is not fun. Next thing is, probably worse, actually, it's some enemies can parry you. So parrying in Dark Souls is when you have a shield or a cestus or some kind of item equipped that has the parry ability. When you parry, you swing it, and if you time it right, if you time it so the swing happens at the exact same time as an enemy attack lands, then you parry the attack, which stuns the enemy and lets you get something called a riposte, which does extra damage. It's a special attack that does more damage. But there's some enemies that can parry you too. Now, you might be thinking, well, if the enemies have the same abilities as the players, then that's just fair. But the thing is, it's not, because there are some abilities that it's okay for the player to have. What the heck was that? What was that? Okay, I think a giant bug just landed behind me. Hopefully it's not going to go for a grab attack. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, some enemies can parry you. For example, in Dark Souls 1, in the lower Undead Burg, there's these ninja... excuse me. These ninja assassin type enemies that, if you hit them, sometimes they'll just parry you. And once they parry you, they can riposte you, which means that you can attack them, and instead of actually dealing damage to them, you instead will take damage because they parried you and riposted you, and that can potentially... Well, first off, it can one-hit kill you sometimes, just like everything in this game, because Dark Souls doesn't know how to do damage decently. I didn't intend the alliteration there. But there's also an enemy in the Ashes of Ariandel. Is that where it is? There's an enemy in the late game in Dark Souls 3 that can parry you, and you should not have to wonder if attacking is going to result in you getting hurt instead. The fact that you can just attack an enemy and have the attack instead reflect back onto you, and you have no way of knowing when this is going to happen, or any way to stop it, that's objectively bad because what's the player expected to do in that situation? Just not attack? Okay, well then they can't kill the enemy, so what are they supposed to do? Just sit there and watch it and hope it doesn't attack them? There's that's the thing is what are you supposed to do against it? That's something that Dark Souls is supposed to be about, like trial and error and figuring out what works and what you're supposed to do against each enemy and boss. And in some cases it is like that, but in a lot of other cases it's like, what do you want me to do? Like, you try one thing, it doesn't work. You try something else, that doesn't work. You try something else, that doesn't work. And you're just yelling at the game, what do you want me to do? What do you want from me? Attacking, like, there's some cases where, like, you attack an enemy, it parries you. You try and dodge an enemy, you get hit with a grab attack. You try and uh, block the attack, it breaks through your shield. You should always be able to identify, okay, this is why I died, this is what I did wrong, and this is what I shouldn't do next time if I want to win. Instead, in Dark Souls, whenever I die half the time, I'm just like, I don't know what I could have done differently in order to not die. So I I'm just at a loss for what the game expects me to do in order to win. And half the time I actually beat bosses, it just feels like I just got lucky that time instead of, oh, I've mastered their attack patterns and now I've figured out how to kill them. Half the time it just feels like there are some bosses that are like that, granted, but there's a lot of others where I'm just like, what else could I have done differently? Does this game want me to do? What is it trying to tell me? What am I allegedly doing wrong here that I should do differently in order to actually succeed? And the game doesn't tell you, and it doesn't give you any indication of what you're supposed to do. So parrying you is just bad because your attacks can randomly, without your knowledge, without any way to avoid it, just ricochet off the enemy and hit you instead, which sucks. The next thing is, some enemies and many bosses have combos where they keep attacking for too long, so you run out of stamina to dodge with, but they're still attacking, which effectively makes them undodgeable attacks. Prime example, Dancer of the Boreal Valley. She has this attack where she spins her swords around in a circle like a tornado and walks towards you. If you're unlucky and she does that in a situation where you don't have enough room to get away from her, the first attack you might be able to dodge. The second attack you might be able to dodge. The third attack you might be able to dodge. But sooner or later you're going to run out of stamina, but she's still doing the attack, and so even though you've dodged properly, you still get hit with the attack because you've run out of stamina to dodge with. Same with blocking. You try and block it, you can block the first few hits, but then you run out of stamina and you get hit inevitably, and there's nothing you can do about it if you happen to be placed in the wrong position, which is really down to luck because you never know when the dancer's going to actually do that attack. And sometimes the attacks are so fast that you can't even dodge them consistently. Like, maybe you have the iframes to dodge one attack, but before you even get out of the dodge animation, i.e. before you regain control of your player, the iframes wear off, but the enemy is still attacking, so you get hit. So you dodge the first attack, but get hit immediately by the second through no fault of your own. Again, there should always be a way to avoid any specific attack or to get out of any specific situation. Now, yes, I know that theoretically it is possible. There are people that have beaten the game blindfolded, beaten the game without getting hit once, etc., but that level of skill should not be required to play the game normally. And it feels like it is, because there's some bosses and enemies that I am just now, after having played the game for years, I'm just now actually being able to, consistently kill. Because only now have I figured out what you're supposed to do, just because of sheer trial and error and having died to the boss like tens of times. Because it doesn't give any indication of, okay, this is what you did wrong, this is why you died, don't do that next time. It's just like, you died, bad luck, too bad, so sad, frick you. Hollow Knight does this a lot better because every enemy does 1 mask of damage. At max, 2. They don't do any more damage than that unless you're overcharmed, which is optional. So, assuming that you're doing your best to avoid getting damaged and you're not overcharming yourself, you only take 2 points of damage from any attack. Any attack, no matter what it is, you only take 2 points of damage, so you know exactly how many hits you have left until you die, which is a really good thing. And you start out with 5 health. The final boss of the game does 2 damage per hit. That's 3 hits. So even the final boss of the game can't one-shot you. It still takes at least 3 hits for it to kill you. More if you're healing during the fight, which you might be, you probably are. Or at least trying to. That's good. That's really good. And also, there are pits in Hollow Knight, but if you land in them, you don't die instantly. You just take 1 mask of damage, 2 if you're overcharmed. And then you respawn back where they started. Which is awesome because you should not be punished with death for making 1 mistake, or even, again, not a mistake. Maybe an enemy shoots you into a pit, and like an enemy that you didn't see shoots you with an arrow, knocks you into a pit, you die instantly. That's just bad game design. Let's see, next thing. I've already talked about it. Every bot... No. You can perfectly dodge 1 attack only for the next attack to hit you before you regain control of your character, especially bad when there's multiple enemies. I mentioned the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, that does that. That should not be a thing. Every boss kill, most of the boss kills, I'll give Dark Souls some credit, most of the boss kills feels like luck instead of skill, or you only beat them because you leveled up a ton. When I fight a boss in Dark Souls, and then I die, I don't think, okay, I see that I did something wrong, I will not do that next time. I think, why did I die? That thing just dealt way too much damage, didn't give me a chance to heal. I died in maybe 1 hit, potentially. I don't know what the game wants from me, so instead of doing what the game wants you to do, which is to keep throwing yourself at the brick wall until it cracks, I just think, I'm obviously not powerful enough for this, so I go and grind levels, and then I come back and beat the boss because I leveled up enough to defeat it. So all my boss kill, or most of my boss kills, just feel like either luck or like I only won because I outleveled the boss, rather than being due to skill or memorizing attack patterns or something like that. Which is incredibly... People always talk about how satisfying it is to finally beat a boss in Dark Souls that you've been struggling against for so long. I don't see it that way because I can't identify what it was that killed me and what I need to do differently next time. For example, what's that one boss? The Centipede Demon in Dark Souls 1. I just summoned help to fight that boss because... And that's another thing. Summoning help makes the game a lot easier, but it's a mechanic that the player might not even know about because they have to be embered or human or whatever the game's equivalent is in order to do that. And then that's never explained to you, at least not explicitly, not in a way that the player is likely to come across that information. So that's basically a hidden game mechanic that makes the game easier, but only if you know it exists, which it's very easy not to. So yeah, a lot of the boss fights just feel like the only reason I beat them is because I got lucky and they didn't do the attack that I have no way of avoiding or blocking or whatever, or I beat them because I leveled up a ton and outranked them in stats. The next thing is, you're supposed to... the game... People are always talking about how Dark Souls encourages you to try different things if you die, but you really don't have that many options for avoiding damage. So let's say there's one attack that keeps killing you in a boss fight. Your options are dodging, blocking, parrying, and running away without doing any of those things. Running away is usually the worst option because you're slow and you don't have iframes. Sometimes you try all of those things and none of them works. Sometimes you dodge roll, it hits you anyway, or it hits you as soon as your dodge roll iframes wear out, or it keeps attacking you until you run out of stamina, and then you just die anyway after you run out of stamina because you can't dodge anymore. Try blocking, it knocks out all your stamina, drains your stamina, knocks away your shield, and then you get hit and killed. You try and parry it, maybe it's an attack that can't be parried, or if it can be parried, you don't know when that timer is, and if you fail once, you're dead. So you really don't have an opportunity to practice to feel out when the timing is. Sometimes, and that means the only thing left is, I don't know, walking away, which that usually doesn't work because you don't have iframes and you're really slow. So you're encouraged. You're supposed to try different things when you die in order to try and beat a boss. But sometimes there's nothing else you can try. Like there's nothing else you can do. You try dodging, blocking, parrying, walking away. That's all the game mechanics. What else are you supposed to do? Try using a different weapon. Most of them have stat requirements, and so unless you're specifically spec'd for that weapon or that weapon type, you probably can't use them. Or maybe they're too heavy and cause you to fat roll. Maybe they're weapons that you just flat out can't use, like maybe magic weapons or miracles or something like that. Like, there's only so much you can do differently. So sometimes you're just at a loss. You're just like, okay, I don't know what you want from me, game. I don't know what you're expected to do to survive this part of the game, but I can't figure out what it is, and the game gives you no indication. So every time you die in a game, it should be your fault. You should be able to see, okay, I messed up. I did something wrong. It's not the game's fault. It's my fault because I did this thing wrong. Now I know, don't do that. That's not how it works in Dark Souls 99% of the time. 99% of the time, sometimes, yes, sometimes there are cases where you get greedy and attack too many times, or you dodge in the wrong direction, or you did something wrong, and it was actually your fault when you died. But most of the time, it doesn't feel like that's the case. Most of the time, it feels like you just died because the game is like, I feel like being not fun today, and then you just die and you have no idea what to do differently. Some enemies attack so fast that you have no time to dodge or block. Sometimes, especially in Dark Souls 3, I feel, some enemies' attacks are so fast, like especially the Lothric Knights, they attack so quickly that if you're not already blocking or dodging, it's inevitable that they're going to hit you because their attack lands faster than neurons can travel through your brain cells. I don't know if that's how brains work, but whatever, sue me. But they attack so fast that you don't have enough time to react. Unless you've already hit the button to dodge or block, you don't have enough time to actually block or avoid the attack. So that effectively makes them unavoidable. And again, unavoidable damage is not good in games. But you can avoid it. You just have to get good. You just have to know when the game is. You just have to get used to the enemy's attacks and stuff. Literally, you do not have enough time between the start of the animation and getting hit to do anything. You just don't have enough time. And again, yes, I know there's people that beat the game without getting hit at all. Again, that level of skill should not be required. Some enemies take almost no damage from most weapons, or at least some weapons that you may be using. For example, Dark Souls 1. Darkroot Garden. I used the normal longsword. It dealt like no damage to the giant broccoli things. I had an axe, which dealt slightly more damage, and I can kill them in like 5 or 6 hits. But that's still quite a lot of hits when you have something that can deal insane amounts of damage and 2 or 3 shot you, or 1 shot you, potentially. Turns out the game wanted you to, of course, use great swords, because Miyazaki has a fetish for great swords, apparently, because he reads too much Berserk, and apparently thinks that people who use other types of weapons should be discouraged from playing video games. And again, great swords are just, and just great weapons in general, are just so much more powerful than all the other. I switched to a +6 great sword, and it was better than my +9 straight sword. And I'm a dex build, not even a strength build. And this greatsword was already better than a higher upgraded weapon. Greatswords basically turn the game into easy mode, which you still die in like 1 or 2 hits, but so do the enemies. And you should not be it's an RPG. You should not be forced into one specific playstyle because it's the only one you can survive in. Because Artorias from the Dark Souls 1 DLC, I had Quaelag's Fury Sword, which is, I think it has S scaling and dexterity. I was playing a dex build. I barely did any damage to him. I could not beat him because I was literally dealing chip damage with one of the best dex weapons in the game and a dex build. I was dealing almost no damage to him. I only managed to beat him in a different save file where I was playing a strength build. Again, an RPG should not force you into a certain playstyle because that's the only one that actually works. That's objectively bad game design. If it's a game where you're supposed to play with great swords and that's the only option you have, that would be fine. But that's not what it is. It's not one of those games where, like, people are always doing challenge runs where they try and beat Skyrim with a soup ladle or something like that. But this isn't the case. This is a case of a player using a weapon that is supposed to be a normal weapon, not a joke weapon, but it's acting like a joke weapon. And it basically forces you into a certain play style. That's just bad. It removes freedom from the game, and there's no indication before playing the game that, hey, don't use this weapon type because the game developer hates it and doesn't want people who play that weapon type to actually be able to kill things. There's no indication of that anywhere in the game. And it's just another case of not communicating. Well, no, even if it was communicated to the player, why even put a type of weapon in the game that doesn't work properly? Like, why even make weapons that are so underpowered that they might as well not exist because no one uses them? It's just bad game design. It really is. It's just bad game design. And that goes right perfectly into my next point. The game heavily favors great swords. No pun intended. Actually, that pun was totally intended. I'm lying. Heavily, because great swords are heavy. But yeah, the game favors great swords. And I'm using great swords to mean any great weapon. Great swords, axes, hammers, maces, clubs, whatever. It heavily favors those. Because number one, they deal more damage. Number two, they give you more poise, so it's harder for enemies to what's the word? Interrupt your attacks. It's harder for enemies to interrupt your attacks because you have more poise, more damage. You can stun enemies with great weapons a lot easier than you can stun them with normal weapons. Let's see, more poise, more damage, stun, and there's a lot of enemies where great weapons are the only thing that actually deals decent damage to them, and you can kill them in like maybe 2 or 3 hits, whereas with a normal weapon like a straight sword it would take like 7 or 8, maybe more, maybe a little less. I'm averaging anyway. You get the point. The point is that it's ridiculous that you should have to... It's ridiculous that one weapon type makes the game... If you use it, the game is much easier. If you don't use it, the game is much harder. And all weapon types should be equal, but they're not. Dexterity weapons are just objectively worse than strength weapons, and you're objectively weaker if you choose to use them. And it just causes, especially new players, a lot of unnecessary trouble that could have been avoided if they either made all weapons equal in power, or at least told the players, hey, this weapon is a lot weaker than this other type, you're encouraged to use this type. But you're not encouraged to use great swords because they have really high strength requirements, and if you're like me, you're putting most of your stats into... If you're like me, you're putting most of your stats into defense and health, but apparently the game hates tank players because if you don't use the strength build, you're just massively underpowered for certain enemies, and it's just too hard to actually progress in the game. Okay, just had to take a break for a second, so I lost my train of thought for what I was talking about last time, so we're just going to move on to the next thing, which is, even if you put all of your stats into health and defense, and wear heavy armor, you can still easily get 1 or 2 shot, which heavily discourages defensive builds and practically forces you to focus on a damage build in a role-playing game. Forcing you to focus on one type of build in a role-playing game is... Why even bother making it a role-playing game? Why even give people the option to put stats into things that aren't actually going to help them very much? Like, even when you have over 1,000 health, you can still die in 2 or 3 hits sometimes. Especially if there's things like ledges to the abyss or grab attacks or a lot of other different things. It's the same thing I was talking about earlier with greatswords. You shouldn't be effectively forced to play the game a certain way because it's the only way that the game is feasibly possible. And that brings me to my next point. If you allocate your stats wrong, you can be insanely underpowered and are basically forced to restart. Now, every stat in the game has some purpose, but some stats are more useful than others. So, for example, if you just level up your luck stat, or maybe maybe you're trying to be a sorcerer, so you level up your intelligence instead of health and defense and strength, which is it seems to be the intended, quote unquote, intended way to play the game, because that's when the game is easiest. I've heard many stories of people who had to restart their first after the first playthrough, but no, before they finished their first playthrough, they had to restart because they allocated their stats wrong and didn't know, and so they effectively wasted all their levels but didn't get any stronger. And the more levels you have, the harder it is to level up the next time. Every level costs more souls than the last level, so you can't just level up. You can't just be like, oh, I see, I'm supposed to level up strength instead and then level that up, because every level that you put in the wrong attribute makes it harder to get the next level. So, like, I feel like you understand what I'm trying to say here. Going from level 1 to level 2, it takes way less souls than going from level 50 to level 51. But the point is, you can allocate your stats, quote unquote, wrong, and if you do that, you're massively underpowered and you probably can't beat the game unless you're incredibly skilled, which if it's your first playthrough, which it's likely because you've misallocated your stats, that's probably going to happen. I've heard a lot of stories of people that put their stats in the wrong thing and had to start a new playthrough because they were massively underpowered. Why even put stats in the game that aren't going to be as useful as other stats? Like, it's a role-playing game. You're supposed to be able to choose which weapon type you want to use and what stats you want to focus on, and it should be easy to know this stat does this stat does this, and it should be a pretty easy decision it should be easy to make an informed decision. But it's not, because the game never tells you that, hey, strength is massively overpowered and everything else is massively underpowered, don't do that. And so you can basically soft lock yourself, which, again, is bad in a role-playing game. Because the entire point of role-playing games is to allow people to choose their own playstyle. Next up, enemy attacks can stun you for way too long. I've mentioned stuns before, I've mentioned how bad they are, but some attacks just stun you for a very long time, and specifically, charge attacks are almost impossible to dodge. A lot of times, enemies will charge at you, which is really hard to avoid because the hitbox for charge attacks is huge, which makes them hard to avoid. Often enemies start charge attacks very quickly, so you don't have much time to react to them, if any at all. And a lot of times, if you try and move out of the way, let's say you dodge to the side when an enemy's doing a charge attack, a lot of times they will turn and hit you anyway, even though you dodged. If you try and dodge the attack, you'll get hit anyway because the enemy will just turn and attack you in your new position. If you can't parry the attack most of the time, or if you can, then I don't know about it because I never try, because it's just not worth the risk. And if you try and block it, you're just going to run out of stamina and get speared through the midsection anyway. And there are a lot of enemies that have charge attacks, and it's just not fun when an enemy has an attack that's almost impossible to avoid. But I think I've already talked about this topic well enough. A lot of these are kind of repeat topics, just talking about more specific things like the charge attacks and stunning and things like that. But that brings us to our next category, which is world design. The world design in Dark Souls is actually very good. That's one of the things they got right. Is the world looks really cool, and it's fun to explore. Problem is, it takes so long to unlock the next area, usually requiring you to beat a very difficult boss, that by the time you get to a new area, you're already sick of the one that you were in before. Like, ideally, your first playthrough should go by fast enough that you don't have time to get sick of any of the areas, and um, so even on your second or maybe even third playthrough, they're still relatively fresh and new, and you can still find new things to explore in them, and you're not sick of them. But that's just not the way the game works, because especially in Dark Souls 1, I feel you stay in the same area for so long that you've memorized the entire thing. Like, it's fun the first time you go through it, and only the first time. Because after that, you stay there for so long to farm souls and do boss attempts and stuff, and you keep dying and getting reset to your last bonfire, so you have to replay through that entire section all over again so many times that you just get sick of the area you're in way too soon. And the exploration of the game is something that's really fun, and so it'd be really nice if that didn't happen. If you didn't, if the that each area of the game overstays its welcome, and it takes so long to get to the next area that you're just sick of it by the time you leave. Instead of going through it fast enough that you don't get sick of it. Going through it fast enough that it doesn't. The next time you play through the game, it still feels relatively fresh and new. I don't know. I'm assuming Elden Ring fixes that because it's an open world game rather than a Metroidvania. But I don't know because I haven't played it yet. Next thing. Enemies, and especially bosses, can knock you off of ledges, which instantly kill you. And also, there are too many drop-offs to the abyss that insta-kill you. And also, it feels like lazy level design. Let me elaborate. So there are a ton of places in Dark Souls where the level just ends in a gigantic chasm to the abyss. Number one, it feels like lazy level design because it's like, really, that's the best thing they could think of to put at the edge of the level. Like, some games have really good levels where the edge of the level doesn't feel like you're secluded into the level area. It feels like it makes sense. Like, maybe you're in a valley and obviously you can't climb up the sides of the cliff, so that provides a natural barrier that feels legitimate and the player doesn't question it. Then you have the cases with like Skyrim where you walk along a path and then eventually you hit an invisible wall and it says you cannot go that way. And then there's Dark Souls, which just puts gigantic chasms to the abyss in like 90% of their levels because they're too lazy to think of a legitimate way, a believable way to end the level. So they're just like, screw it, just make a giant heck all abyss that insta kills you. That's fun. Like, I prefer an invisible wall to just insta kill mechanics. You should not die when you fall into a pit. You should lose maybe like half of your health and then respawn at the edge or something. Like Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is just Dark Souls, but better in every single conceivable way. When you fall in the pit in Hollow Knight, you take 1 damage and respawn at the edge. When you fall off the pit in Dark Souls, you die instantly. And that leads me to the next part, which is the level design makes you slide off cliffs at stupid moments. A lot of times, you have to walk on a very narrow path above a giant chasm. Like on the path down that leads off of Darkroot Garden in Dark Souls 1. There's this one specific spot where, and this happens a lot in the games, but this is just one example of it, where the level geometry is rounded at the edge of the cliff. So even if you don't walk off the cliff, if you step on the part of the level that's rounded, you effectively slip and slide sideways off the cliff. Like, it punts you sideways. Even though you were on solid ground, the edge isn't a square, it's a circle, so you just slide off and fall into the abyss and die anyway. That's incredibly bad game design because I'm not even going to justify that. If you can't tell why that's a problem, then, well, maybe you're part of the problem. Because that's just objectively bad game design, where you can step on something that is solid ground, and still it slides you off the edge and insta-kills you, which, again, it should not insta-kill you. There should not be insta-kills. insta-kills are just bad. I don't like insta-kills. And um, another thing is half of the required ways to go to complete the game, i.e. the path you're supposed to take to progress, are hidden in obscure places that you would never guess would be the way to progress, so you're basically forced to look it up. For example, perfect example is Anor Londo in Dark Souls 1. Guess what the way to progress to the next area is? No, it's not the bridge that goes directly forward. That would make too much sense. No, instead you have to go to the side of the bridge, drop down onto this little platform, go onto one of the, I don't know, eaves? Is that what you call it? One of the little pathway tower thingy. I'll have to find some footage and put it here because I can't explain it, but it looks like it's it looks like part of the background level design, like the part that you're not supposed to actually go to, that is just there to look good, but you can't actually go there, and if you try, then you'll just clip through it and fall and die, or there's an invisible wall that prevents you from going there. It looks like one of those things, like one of those cases where you're not supposed to actually go there, but it's the intended way to go. Why? Why is the intended way to go this incredibly difficult thing that I don't even know how the first person who figured that out actually figured it out without I feel like half of the things in Dark Souls are only, that's not a word, but figure outable if you data mine the game and actually look through the game's code to figure out what the heck you're supposed to do, because it's so unintuitive. And I really hate games that force you to wiki stuff to progress. And Dark Souls feels like one of them. There's also tons of secret walls behind, like where you supposed, like the Great Hollow. There's this one spot where you're in Blight Town. You have to hit a wall behind a treasure chest, and or not behind it. You have to hit a wall, and that takes you to a secret area with a treasure chest in it. Then you have to hit the wall behind the treasure chest, which takes you to another secret area, which takes you to a place that you're intended to you're supposed to be able to go there. There's a secret within a secret in a place that you would not guess that there would be a secret there unless you get extremely lucky, and it's supposed to be a place that you're supposed to go to. Like, I don't think it's required for progression at all. Like, you can beat the game, I think, without ever going into Great Hollow. But it's just this entire area that you have no idea. The only way you're going to find it is by pure luck, which is ridiculous. It's just bad game design. Again, it's just, there's so many things where it's so hard to figure out how to do it that I wonder how the people who write the wikis and guides and stuff, I wonder how they figured it out, because it's so not obvious. We're almost done here. This is the other category. Quests and NPC quests are so needlessly convoluted, it's impossible to follow them without using the wiki. For example, Grey Rat. This is one of the less complicated quests in the game. Grey Rat goes out to loot each town you come across, or settlement, or whatever. But the last two, well, the last one, which is, what's it called? Irithyll. If you send him to pillage an Irithyll, he will die unless you send either Patches or Sigurd to save him. But the way to do this is so complicated. Like, it's not obvious at all. You have to specifically do each part of Sigurd and or Patches' quest line at a specific time, in a specific order, and then only go to the new areas in specific times, at specific times, coinciding with other specific times of the NPC quest line, to the point where, how are you supposed to figure it out yourself? Like, just go to Dark Souls Wiki and look up literally any NPC quest line. It's so convoluted, there's almost zero chance that you're going to figure it out on your own. Who figured these out? And why are they required for 2 of the 3 endings in the game? I may have gotten that slightly wrong. There might be only 2 endings, or maybe there's 4, or I don't know. But point is, NPC quest lines should not be so convoluted. You need a frickin' flow chart to tell you exactly what order to do everything in the game in order to actually complete them. And it's just ridiculous. Why is that there? It doesn't serve any purpose other than being needlessly convoluted and annoying and difficult. The final thing I have is the menu takes absolutely forever to get past the opening logos and stuff, and you have to wait for it to connect to the server before you can access the actual menu to quit the game. So you quit the main menu, and then it fades out, fades in, From Software, fades out, fades in, Havoc, fades out, fades in, Dark Souls 3, start game, start, connecting to online servers, please wait, connecting, authenticating, and then you can and then you can go down and actually quit the game. Why does it take so long to exit the game? 9 times out of 10, I just Alt F4 because it's faster. Why would you make it so complicated? Why would you make it so complicated? And also, in Dark Souls 3 especially, any volume changes you made to the game do not apply until you press any key to continue, which means that you have this really loud chanting of the main menu song, which it's a cool song, but it's really loud, so you have to turn your volume down, press any key to continue, then turn your volume back up. Why is it so loud? Why? So many problems. But I'm just about done with this. I have a few more topics, like 2 or 3 small things. There's the get good attitude I mentioned in the last video, where people are like, oh, technically it's possible to do the entire game without getting hit while blindfolded and using a blender as a controller or whatever. Yes, technically that's possible. But it shouldn't be expected. You should not be expected to be able to play that well in order to avoid death in certain circumstances. Like, the next thing I have goes perfectly with that. Hollow Knight does everything Dark Souls does, but way better. And again, I do like the Dark Souls games, but there's so many problems with them that I'm constantly annoyed because I can see the potential that the game has, but it's ruined by all these annoyances. Like in Hollow Knight, every time you die, most of the time it feels like your fault, or it feels like you haven't studied the enemy's attack animations enough. Once you figure out the enemy's attack patterns, then you can just move out of the way a lot easier, which is strange because it's a 2D game, so you'd think that having one less dimension to dodge in would make things harder, especially since you don't get a dodge that gives you iframes until much later in the game. But it's actually easier than in Dark Souls, which is a 3D game, and you have a dodge roll that gives you iframes, and yet it feels worse to play, and a lot of times it just feels like, when you die, it just feels like bad luck instead of you making a mistake, and that's not good. Even if technically it was your fault, it shouldn't feel like the game's fault. It should feel like your fault when you fail. And it should be your fault when you fail. That's, what are they called? Hapu Games that made Risk of Rain, that's their philosophy, is that every time you die, it should be your fault, and you should be able to see exactly what you did wrong to end up killing you. They even have a mechanic called one-shot protection, where if you're above, like, I think 90% of your health, then one single attack can't bring you down to 0. It just brings you down to, like, 1 health or something like that. Unfortunately, you do end up, a lot of times, like, you'll get hit 3 times in a row, and the first attack will drain your health almost to 1, and then the next attack will kill you. So the one-shot protection doesn't always actually work, because you get hit multiple times at once. But at least it's there. At least they tried. In Dark Souls, you can die in one hit so easily. Falling off cliffs, falling into bottomless pits, getting hit by enemies, getting hit by grab attacks, getting parried by an enemy, getting wombo comboed, and losing a little bit of your health each time, but before you can recover, you get hit with another attack, which resets your stun animation, and so you just get stun locked to death. There's so many problems with the game. There's so many stupid ways to die that shouldn't be possible, and so many times when it's just not your fault and when it's just down to bad luck. And I'm gonna say it, I know that it's a hotly debated topic, and I know it's never going to be implemented, but I will say that Dark Souls does need an easy mode. It should have an easy mode, because an entire genre of games, Souls-likes, should not be restricted to... Oops. Difficulty just went up. That's my alarm. An entire genre of games, Souls-likes, should not be restricted to people who are really good at the game, because the gameplay itself is fun, but it's too hard. What does that mean? It means that there are tons of people that would love the Dark Souls games, but they physically are not good enough to beat them, and so they can't play them, or don't play them, because maybe they have a job, and so they don't have enough time to get good, and to memorize all the enemies' attack patterns, and They don't have hours and hours to throw at the game. Maybe they have like 1 hour a day because they have a job, or they're in school and have to study, or maybe even both, or maybe they just don't have split-second timing and incredible reflexes, or maybe they even have a disability and like they physically cannot move or think fast enough in order to survive in these games. But they would love to play them if they were possible to play for them. But they require such a high level of skill that only people like me that have tons of hours to throw at these games can actually enjoy them. Because I'm sure there's tons of people that tried Dark Souls games but ended up just watching YouTube playthroughs of them because they like the lore, they like the idea of having to dodge attacks instead of just like games like Skyrim where you just spam click and outstat the enemy and outlast them. And they like the idea of having like dodge mechanics to dodge enemies and having to memorize attack patterns, and they like the lore, they like the aesthetic, and they could like everything about the game, but just not physically be good enough to be able to actually play it. And again, an entire genre game should not be restricted to only the best players. And an easy mode would not make the game any less satisfying for everyone else, because then it would change a normal Dark Souls playthrough from you being able to say, I beat Dark Souls, to I beat Dark Souls on hard mode, which would, I mean, if it's bragging rights you're after, then you would have that if the game had an easy mode. And you don't have to play on the easy mode, it would just make things better. It would make the game more accessible. A game that's really hard that has incredible accessibility options is Celeste. Another one is Dead Cells. Then there's Crosscode. And Dead Cells, Celeste, and Crosscode are indie games, I believe. All of them are. And they're indie games that are made by a few people. And they have more accessibility options. They're very hard games, but they have a lot of accessibility options, much more than multi-billion-dollar game companies' games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring. Again, I haven't played Elden Ring, but Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Demon Souls and all that. And I don't, Kingsfield doesn't even count, but if these indie developers can put all these accessibility options in their game, then these AAA developers should definitely be able to. And no one complains that Celeste's assist mode makes the game any less satisfying to play. No one has complained about Dead Cells having accessibility options, because the thing is, there's nothing to complain about. Accessibility options just make the game easier, and accessibility options sometimes are the only thing that make the game possible for certain people to play them. And games should be able to be enjoyed by as many people as possible. Games shouldn't be relegated to only the best players being able to enjoy them. It's just ridiculous. So, with that finishes off my entire very long list of all the problems with Dark Souls. Thank you for watching. If you watched or at least listened to all of this, I really appreciate it. Thank you a lot, because I put a lot of effort and time into this. 2 hours at least just of recording, and even more for editing. So I appreciate you sticking through all this. If you agree or disagree, or if you have any thoughts or any comments at all, please put them in the comments. I would love to see your comments, love to see your perspectives on everything I've said. And yeah, so I think that's it. So to summarize, the Too Long Didn't Watch is just, Dark Souls is a good game, but not a great one. It would be a great one if it weren't for all these incredibly annoying bad game design things that are in the games. And they prevent me from enjoying it fully as much as I would have otherwise been able to. Bad controls, bad game design, there's so many things, but no one seems to talk about them. A lot of people seem to act like these horrible game design decisions just don't exist. Like, every video essay you see about Dark Souls is just praising it and completely looking through rose-colored glasses and ignoring all the problems and massive flaws that it has. So I decided that I wanted to make a video talking about the stuff that other people don't talk about. So that's it. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I made you think a bit and maybe entertained you. And so that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Goodbye.